Hey everybody, welcome to Shop Talk. We're back this week, continuing on from last week's talk about editing. We've got a lot to go over today, so I think we'll just get started. As always, I'm joined by Matthew.
I think you might have tapped your mute there. Not 100% sure. But anyway, yes. Hello. Matt Bliss here. Here to talk again about podcast editing. Founder of mbpod.com. My podcast, though, is actually going to be changing. It was previously Coffee with a Podcaster, but I've got a brand new project in the works that you should keep an eye out for. And yeah, I'm very tired because I was woken up very early by my unfortunately broken car alarm. And I'm hoping the rest of the neighborhood doesn't hate me just as much as I hate myself now. But I am very much up for a discussion about editing today. I've got a feeling we're not just going to be restricted to audio. We might have a chat about video editing as well, but it's going to be all about the techniques, all of those, I guess, physical actions as opposed to the quality, although they are necessarily interrelated, aren't they, Jesse?
They are, and I think the first thing we should talk about is what makes a good editor. What are the things that really stand out when you're listening to an episode that make you go, that was really well done? For me, I've got to reference my notes or I'm going to forget everything. For me, the first thing is the edits, they're invisible. You don't hear them. You don't know that the episode was actually edited. That is the hallmark of a really good editor. It's less about what you take out and a lot more about what you decide to leave in. And then a good editor understands the nuances of human speech. That's what allows their edits to be invisible, because we can hear how the intonation between cuts match or don't match. There's all sorts of little nuances, the amount of space between words. If you get any of that off, it's going to be noticeable that it's been edited, even if the edit itself is perfectly clean. And that's where I think a lot of people start to misunderstand things. I see people talk about how I can tell when an episode's been edited by Descript. Well, not really. A good editor using Descript, you won't be able to tell the difference between them editing in a DAW. What you're hearing is bad editing, whether that's AI or human. Bad editing calls attention to itself. That's not necessarily a problem that is inherent to Descript, but if you rely on Descript to do all of the edits, yes, you're going to have those audible edits. So
Yeah, that's such a funny thing too. Like the line blurs so much between the two.
So what makes a good editor in your eyes?
I think exactly what you said. The goal, as I usually say every week, is that the editor should be invisible. The experience for the listener should be like the conversation wasn't cut together at all. If it is a conversation, like obviously there are kinds of podcasts that necessarily must sound edited. But talking from an entirely dialogue perspective, you do want to make sure it sounds natural, and the best editor will be entirely invisible. And at the same time, being able to make the kind of cuts to make yourself invisible, but also ensure that any cuts you have to make that aren't ideal are also obscured somewhat, and maintaining that natural language progression as it goes through. I think generally the major thing that gets revealed between the two is whether people go through the entire conversation recording or do something like Descript, where they look for keywords, lift them out, and then don't go through the effort to do the rest of it. And I think just for podcast editors out there who are listening to this and trying to take notes for themselves as freelancers trying to offer services to other people as an editor, I think there's always a phase, and we see it in Facebook comments all the time, that you start to get very critical of other people's work, and you start to go, oh, I could have done a better job than he did. I can hear this and this and this and this. And I really like what you said there, Jesse, about the kind of the jumping at ghosts kind of thing. Like you can say, oh, that was edited in Descript, but it was actually just a very rough cut job done by someone who maybe doesn't have enough experience. I think the same can happen with people who have a manner of speaking that you would assume could be cleaned up better, but it's actually been cleaned as much as it can be, and this is the final product. You don't know what the raw sounds like compared to the edited, and making that comparison as an editor yourself without having the baseline recording makes it really hard for you to be the best judge of what the final product was and whether you would be able to do a better job. There's a few examples that come to mind of podcasts that I point out where this might be a thing, but yeah, waffling around a little bit. As I said, I'm tired. Sorry, this is how this session might go, guys. Yeah, I think the good editor is the one who appears to be invisible and makes themselves unknown by making sure that the progression, the natural language, the intonation, like you said as well, all of that stuff just flows naturally as if it was a conversation that happened without any edits having been made.
And that's a good point. We never hear the raw audio. So a lot of times we either hear the editing or we don't. A lot of times what I hear are people who are really good at editing, but maybe they're not so good with the mixing. I've heard a ton of shows that are just so compressed. It's like, why are you doing this? I can't listen to it because it's just so tiring. Too much compression is a bad thing. I've looked at so many professionally edited episodes where you can tell it's just brick wall limited. There's no dynamics there. It's similar to the people who do the shorts in video editing, where they cut out all the breaths, all of the gaps. It becomes a lot more challenging to absorb stuff when you take out all of those breaths and all of the gaps between words, because you're trying to fit 90 seconds of audio into 60 seconds. Our brains need those pauses, those dynamics to really absorb what's being said. When it comes to compression, we need those dynamics so our ears don't get tired as we listen. And I hope the people who are mixing in this way aren't mixing this way before they edit, because that's got to be tough on the ears after a while. And we've got a couple of comments. Mike says, agree on invisibility. The focus are the people speaking. And then compression typically is evoked to make small files in an age when the size of the files is next to meaningless. It's also the last gasp to get the radio voice that is reasonably short order won't be around. So yeah, I think a lot of the heavy compression comes from the radio people who are in podcast editing. That's the sound they're used to. And I hope as time goes by, we're getting further and further away from that, because you can still have dynamics that people can hear in all sorts of situations without losing the low volume bits, without just compressing and squashing the life out of it. It just becomes fatiguing to listen to. I mean, I think about someone who's listening with earbuds on a subway or any other loud place. that heavily compressed audio is going to be very tiring and hard on their ears because they're already listening at louder volumes. Well, hopefully they're using something that has good sound isolation these days, so they don't need to listen as loudly. But we do need to think about the audience, not we need to have this type of sound like radio or whatever drives that heavy compression mindset.
Yeah, and I think this leads to what will be our first mic drop, I think. If I don't want to, blow my own horn or whatever. But I think one of the key things when you start editing a podcast is that you kind of need to know where the goalposts are when you get started. Like you're going to look for how to set these settings up. Compression is an ideal one. Again, we see a lot of comments out there that say, here's my settings for compression on my podcast. Steal these and use them for yourself. Of course, it's a great starting point. Invariably, it ends up being terrible on whatever person who chooses to use it after them because their voice is different, their mic is different, their recording setup is different, their environment is different. All those things are different. But I think at the start, when you're thinking about having a checklist of things to make sure that your podcast will sound good, having all those things is fine. But as you continue to get better at editing, you'll start to reduce that checklist. You won't have goalposts to kick the ball through, lest I continue the metaphor, but instead you'll have things that you do as you edit that lead to the final result that you want instead. Like instead of checking that you've done the compression this way at the end, throughout the entire edit, you've heard the episode and you've picked up on what the dynamic range is like. And if it's huge, then maybe a light compression might do the job. Or if it's, 6 or 7 times of uproarious laughter, but otherwise like humble listening, whispering, then maybe a limiter or just some volume writing for those small sections that had the uproarious laughter that you can see in the waveform. And these checks aren't just for settings that you apply across the entire thing. I've also seen a couple of times it get asked, my waveform for my podcast episode looks like this. Is this too blocky or should it look different? And the answer invariably is it depends. But if it's looking blocky, it's because you've got an hour and a half of content there that doesn't have a visible dynamic range because it's like trying to look at a map of, I don't know, the United States and pick out a road from a satellite. Like it's really hard to see what kind of nuance you'd get from a waveform like that. And people would give advice like, I use compression, I make sure I squash all those highs and bring up the lows so that the dynamic range is minimal. And someone takes that advice and all of a sudden that sounds, like you said, Jesse, awful. The point I'm making is that the more you edit, the more you figure out how to reach these goals without ticking them off on a list at the end. And once you have that innate ability throughout the edit, you can get to the ideal state that you want the podcast to be in. And I don't think we can reasonably expect new editors to be able to do that from the get-go, unless they're like yourself, Jesse, and have a bit of an audio engineering background. But yeah, I think that's part of the profile too. I think the it depends answer does a lot of work for experienced editors, which means that they have the ability to, dial in the compression where needed, or, selectively use a mouth declick, or selectively use a denoiser if they need to,
I do know. And I think that for anybody starting out, the worst thing to do is try to go for that broadcast radio sound, unless you're doing something that's a lot more produced, where you're going for that radio show, that narrative style show with a lot of sound design. I could see that maybe being the type of sound you might go for. If it's heavily compressed, I'm not listening at all. As soon as I hear that, I'm gone. That's just me, though. There are people who enjoy that sound. But I think if you're doing anything that's more conversational, it should sound more like real dialogue. It should sound like a conversation between people in a room. Yeah, we'll compress it some to make it easier for people to hear when they're in noisier environments. But it should still sound more like an actual conversation than something that's heavily produced and gone through all of the radio style processing.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let's move on to the actual editing. When I edit, since I don't really have a podcast, I'm always editing for others. I'm editing for, well, I guess according to YouTube, this is my podcast. I didn't realize I became a podcaster, but YouTube told me I was.
Hang on, just very quickly before you move on. Are you saying that because the podcast charts were recently announced for YouTube and that Tansy Astor Academy or at Jesse McCune, this channel, appeared on that list? Is that why you're saying that?
I'm saying that because they created a tab in my YouTube page called podcasts.
Oh, okay. Fair enough.
So
okay.
they identified certain things as podcasts. I did not create that tab, but it's there, and
Really?
they put stuff in there. Yeah.
No. Okay, you keep going. I'm going to quickly explore that because I'm very curious.
But let's talk about the actual editing and what I edit. Like I was saying, since I edit for clients, a lot of my direction comes from the clients themselves. I have clients who are more in the professional space. They talk to executives, they offer coaching or consulting services, they're thought leaders, and they want everything to sound as polished as possible. And by polished, that means removing as many of the filler words as possible. They want everybody to sound as smart as I can make them sound. Because let's face it, the more somebody sits around umming and ahhing, the less professional they sound, the less smart they sound. So those types of shows, they place a premium on removing those filler words. I have other clients who want me to keep things more conversational. They want it to sound, I don't like that terminology, but they want it to sound more real than if we were to cut everything up. Authentic, and that's a pet peeve I have. People who say, well, I leave in so many filler words just to make it sound real or to be more authentic. So let's ask this. If we think about this, if we're saying we need to leave ums in there to make it sound real, that means that if there aren't ums, it must not sound real. So I guess since I don't that must mean everything I put out there must be edited, even this live stream, because other than you saying the word in these instances, you won't hear me using it as a filler word. So does that make this less authentic?
No. And another something that grinds my gears a lot is that there's a lot of content out there now from speech coaches telling people to avoid filler words in just daily life. You know, like why it's a terrible thing to include or not include, and, you know, how to make yourself sound natural. It's not I'll have trouble articulating it. I think you articulated it very well, so I'll stick with yours. But yeah, I completely agree. I think authenticity is how it appeared. And if that means that you're going to question every time someone doesn't like I think probably the most amount of ums that we'll have for any one of these live streams will be happening right now as we say I'm not much of an these days either.
Mike says, the more real or authentic is something I typically refer to as live room. The concept that anyone that touches or edits a podcast is somehow less authentic is preposterous. And exactly. Pretty much all of the media we consume is produced somehow. there's either a ton of work put in on the front end if it's some kind of a live performance. So anything where, like, live news, live presentations, you've got scripts, you've got teleprompters. It's very rare that someone is just up there talking off the cuff in these professional environments. You have books, music, movies, TV shows. There's a ton of pre-production that goes into it. You record, then there's post-production. That doesn't make it any less authentic. That just means we care about the listener or the viewer's time. We're not going to waste it by just not editing. I think a lot of that authenticity and editing makes it less real comes from people trying to justify not editing themselves, or because they don't edit well, so they just choose not to. I think that's where a lot of this comes from, because I've never had anybody ever come back and say, can we revisit this edit because it just doesn't sound authentic. It doesn't sound real. If anything, people comment on, hey, you make us sound really smart. This sounds so much better than I remember the conversation going, because we cut out those distractions. We cut out the things to make everybody sound smarter and more polished.
And that's a really funny thing too. Maybe a subject for another time, but a client who queries the raw material against the edited material and starts talking about what you should leave in, I think sometimes isn't as constructive as they think it is. But I'll leave that on the table for a discussion for another time. To kind of ground the authenticity stuff that you're talking about, an example of a case where I would presume to make an edit based on the authenticity of the person showing up is if there was a section of a conversation that someone had as the host with a guest, and that part of the conversation wasn't representative of their overall, demeanor, their persona, their knowledge base, intelligence, the things that you'd expect to see of them as a host or as a person being represented by the podcast. There has been a case where one of my clients has chosen not to air an episode that she'd recorded because it was with a guest that wasn't really connecting with her as a host, was someone who wasn't really up for talking about the things that the host was asking about, and the subject matter didn't really align to the podcast mission at all. Now, if you asked in a forum, I had a really bad and this happens a lot as well. I had a really bad conversation. Didn't really go all that well. Should I put this episode out or should I just leave it in the can? And a lot of people will still come out and say, "No, release it. Like, you have to be vulnerable. Release the stuff that you're not too sure about. Everything's good content. People will be along on the journey with you." But as an editor, I would look at that or start cutting it together, and did, and would kind of say, well, I think maybe this, an hour and 50 minutes being cut down to 25 minutes is fairly indicative of how much of this content is actually useful and how much of it actually represents what should be in the podcast. And in that case, you give it the chop. The authenticity barely factors in, but the authenticity as part of that example is that whether it represents the host well, the guest well, the podcast well, being authentic to the mission, not just authenticity for, authenticity's sake, I guess. Because I am aware that it's very easy to give advice, and we see a lot of it on social media and in courses and stuff about what not to do. But I think having a what to do and a very concrete example for people to frame the way that they approach it, especially for freelance podcast editors like we are, I think that's a really good way to kind of frame it up.
And to kind of wrap up the part about filler words and ums and uhs, I see so many people that think it's an either or thing. We either have to leave them in or we have to cut them out. And that's where it goes back to knowing what to leave in. Not all ums are created equal. And even if they're there, if they're not becoming an annoyance or I'm drawing a blank on the word, if they're not being a distraction, they are fine there. If someone says every few minutes, that's not going to be a distraction. There's times where people will as they're thinking about something because it's something they were asked a question that requires some deep thought. Maybe it's an emotional question, something where they're having to reach deep, fighting some emotions, trying to find the best way to answer. In those cases, an very well should be left in because it conveys that someone is thinking instead of just cutting the shortening out that gap so you have question and answer. A lot of times it's worth leaving that and pause in there because it conveys to us that the person is thinking, that this is something a little more than just a quick question answer type response.
Agreed. And I hate seeing people counting how many ums they remove from an interview, because you know that because they can count it that they've used something to count the removals unless they've had a tally next to them. But I like seeing 122 ums removed, 5 left in, or something like that. It means that there's some intentionality there with how they're approaching it.
I agree. I don't know. One of my pet peeves. I don't understand the people who do post about all of the things they cut out. It sounds almost like they're using it as a badge of honor or something. And
Yeah,
I've never once counted how many. I've never felt the need to go and count how many filler words or how much time I saved, cut down an episode. That's just not my style, and I'm sure there are some editors out there who have spreadsheets of every episode they've ever edited, what the raw audio was, what it was after they edited, how long it took them to edit, how many filler words. I'm just not that organized. We've got a couple more comments from Mike. I'm divided in the hour, 50 to 25 minute proposal, mostly because there's a difference between discerning value and providing value to someone that was likely of very little value to the host and their goals if you're removing so much content. And yeah, that goes back to the situation you were talking about where people are asking, should I publish this episode that I know deep down just isn't a good episode?
Yeah, and there's gradations in there too, just like everything. You know, it depends. It's in the gray whether you choose to include it or not. It's definitely not a yes or a no. It's got to be decided. Intentional.
Yep. The hunting is something I will commonly leave in. It'll typically include a physical vocal change or tone. And yeah, that's something I want to talk a little more about is that goes back to knowing when to leave things in. When you have a tonal or intonation mismatch between the before and after edit, a lot of times a good example is when someone ends a sentence and then there's laughter and then they start in right after the laughter. They're still coming down from that laugh, so their voices are probably a little bit louder, they're a little bit higher pitched. But if you try to cut that section immediately after the laughter and go into something like the next sentence in, there's going to be a complete mismatch because you go from a 10 down to like a 3 in terms of volume and emotion. It doesn't match up. Similar with if someone's recording in a really reverberant room, and you cut off the reverb tail, which might still be there even with noise and reverb reduction. That calls attention to itself because you hear that reverb's cut off. And that goes back to really being able to critically listen to the audio, and understanding how people speak and the nuances of speech.
Yeah. And I don't know how this will land with you. We've talked about aphantasia before, but I try to think of the mouth position sometimes when I'm thinking of that intonation. Like after a laugh, if they've been quite serious and then done a laugh, the mouth position is going to affect that intonation. And trying to, like, imagine trying to do that in video. It'd be like, a very harsh cut in a video like that. So you probably just leave it in which case you wouldn't cut the laughter because you need the context to be able to retain it. And just as I'm doing this, I can tell that on the stream that my video is a little bit rough. But anyway, yeah, completely agree with the intonation stuff. You can't just, it will sound unnatural. And there'll be someone listening who says, oh, yeah, someone edited that poorly. But we've got another big comment from Mike there that I think we should probably dive into a little bit. You might have muted yourself as well.
I did mute myself. Brian was agreeing with Mike. I'm guessing it has to do with the removing content. And then we've got a couple more from Mike. I'm also a fan of there being silence. The requirement that all must remove every single space that doesn't have voice in it. Ugh. Exactly. That space is there. Our brains need that space to process what was just said. If we cut, like I said earlier, watch a 5-minute video that was edited in the style of a short. About 2 minutes in, your brain kind of shuts down, says, I can't process what's being said. Those spaces are very important for the way our brain works. That's where it gets the time to process and absorb what's being said. If we remove that, at some point, it just can't keep up and gets tired. It's like running 5 miles. If you keep going at that pace, eventually you're going to get tired. Same thing with dialogue. We need those breaks, those pauses.
The shorts thing is real, though. Like, my wife listens to or watches, I'm not sure if it's Instagram or if it's TikTok or whatever, but there are reels that layer the voices together where there is no space. And I don't know how they do it without getting tired, how they listen to that stuff. It's like, I went to the shops to buy a drink for my person. Then I went to the place to buy the food and it was really great food. And then I went to buy a t-shirt and that t-shirt was really great. And then I went home. Like, there's just no spaces. Yeah, completely agree. It's not a lot of disagreement coming from me today.
Then another one from Mike. Original time raw versus final file is a good solid note for the quick hit of what kind of work you're doing at a glance. I don't use it when I'm adding in intro, outro ads, lives, etc., because the length then becomes irrelevant. And I can see the benefit in keeping that kind of data for kind of selling your services, letting the client know what you're doing. But I come from things from a different approach, in that it's, to me, I look at the overall episode as the value I'm providing. I don't think a lot of clients really care how much time I trimmed off or how many filler words. They just care about the overall product. So as long as they're happy with the product, I don't feel like I need to do anything to provide them some kind of proof about what I'm doing. But that's just my approach, and maybe it's the clients I'm working with. I've never felt the need to have to justify my rates or what I'm offering them.
That goes back to what I said before too. Like the client comparing, like having an editor, the client comparing the raw to the edited, I don't think there's a huge amount of value for them in doing that. But the danger point I wanted to mention with what you've just said, and I've heard it bandied about a little bit, saying that, like, you know, when you finish a podcast episode, you want to have at least, like, you know, 10 to 15% whacked off it. You know, that's a number that you should probably, that you would like to see for an episode that has been adequately edited. I think that having a number like that as one of those checklist items that I was mentioning before that beginner editors have as a like a goalpost for them to aim for when they're editing an episode, I think they're very dangerous to have as well. Like the idea that you must necessarily remove a certain amount of content regardless of the contents of the recording. I think having that number just doesn't, it's not constructive. Not to me anyway.
That ties in with like how long an episode should be. It should be as long as it needs to be. Same thing with editing. If you have a really solid episode that doesn't have any fluff or off-topic tangent type stuff, why would you want to cut down 10 or 15% of that just because somebody said you need to do that? There are no clear-cut rules on things. Everything comes down to personal preference. Even the people who want to leave in all of the ums and not edit, that's fine. It's your show. It's your call. You get to decide how you want to approach things. So I guess we should have started with a disclaimer like we did last week, and that there are no real rules here. What we're talking about are our opinions, what we've learned and seen over the years of being in this space.
That's right.
Do with it what you will, but there's no real right or wrong. The audience will determine if they want to listen to your show or not. If they're listening and you've got the audience you're happy with, then you're doing things right. If you're not happy with the audience you have, there's probably some areas in there that can be improved.
We're a reference, not a Bible. Maybe
Exactly.
that's I don't know if that's a good way to put it. Touch wood.
And then following up on our talk about shorts, Mike says, how do they listen to that shorts stuff? They don't. It's tossed in a generator and pooped out the other end. Exactly.
Yeah.
And they're conditioned to listen to it because if that's what they're creating, they hear it so much, they tune out to it.
It's probably a very controversial opinion for someone in my position to say something like this. I think I said it on I was a guest on the Podcaster Nation a couple of weeks ago. It came out last week, if anyone wants to have a look. But I think shorts are they are pooped out on the other end. They're not about content. They're about manipulation of people's dopamigenic tendencies to latch onto something that tickles the chemicals that douse their brain in something that allows them to vegetate for 30 seconds at a time. I don't think there's much value in the shorts in their current state. Unless you can intrigue someone enough or make them curious enough or even like snap them out of that dopamine reaction to be able to click on a link to go and check out your podcast. Yeah, I'm not a fan of them, in all fairness.
Well, I hope that House of Jen is watching, because at the end of last week's stream, she mentioned Frankenbites, which was a term neither one of us had heard before, but it's definitely something that you can't have a conversation about editing without talking about it. And for anybody who's unaware of Frankenbits, was it Frankenbits or Frankenbites?
Frankenbites, I think.
That sounds
with the
right.
Y?
I think
I
it
don't know.
was.
We discovered it last week.
But she was asking about it and our thoughts on it. We didn't have time to go into it last week. We told her we'd jump into it this week. So yeah, for anybody who's unfamiliar with Frankenbites, that's when you take and basically splice parts of two different things together to form one. There's at least two different situations I can think of where that's going to occur. The first one, Matt and I did talk about this one briefly before we went live, and that's when you have someone who false starts a sentence and then restarts. You have to do something there. A lot of times the restart is not clean. A lot of times it's probably a little bit rushed because they realize they misstated something or needed to restart. No matter how well you try to advise people to, in those instances, pause and restart, they just restart right away. So you get those intonation mismatches that Mike brought up earlier. So that's one place where you're going to have to Frankenbite those two pieces together. Because usually the beginning of the false start is going to sound natural. It follows the last sentence. It's all flowing. We need to find a place somewhere in that initial false start to splice with the second start. Usually I try to find the word towards the end of the false start to blend in. The further into that, the further towards the end of that false start we can make the cut, the more likely they're going to blend together. What are your thoughts on handling that situation?
Precisely that. It's the way I think about it. It's like trying to find a puzzle piece that kind of matches the whole perfectly. And if the two different puzzle pieces are intonations and variants in the method of approaching a specific word, sometimes to make that fold over to make the sentence flow work, you kind of have to play with the sections that will match up well. And generally it takes a couple of listens. When you get really skilled at it, it takes maybe a couple of seconds to find where that carryover is, where it sounds natural enough. And there will be generally consonants that you'll be able to fold over quite well. I find myself using the waveform quite a lot as well, trying to avoid, like, not entirely the waveform, but like seeing where the waveform can be attached together without there being a big variance, like if it looks like it flows, just as a secondary kind of check. But yeah, intonation puzzle pieces. Sometimes it takes a few tries, but you can get it together eventually.
And that's a situation where I'll oftentimes leave the false start in there if I can't find a way to quickly make it match. Because the thing we all need to remember is the listeners, they understand this is human speech. It's never going to be perfect. No one's going to stop listening if we leave that false start in. So it goes back to good editing is more about knowing when to leave things in as opposed to just cutting everything out. And you made a good point about splicing in between, like, syllables. I try to attack it by, if I can find a clean cut between words, I'll go that route, because that's going to be the easiest, cleanest way to do it. If that's not possible, I'll look for, like you said, certain syllables or certain consonants are really easy to splice together. Others, not so much. So I'll look for one of those. And my rule of thumb when making any edit, I'll spend 60 seconds max on the edit. If I can't find something that works in that 60 seconds, I undo and just move on. It's not worth my time to spend any more time on any given edit, because to the listener, it's not going to make or break the show. It's not going to make them decide to change, to stop and go listen to something else.
In fact, if you do too many of this Frankenbiting technique and they catch every single one of them in sequence, all of those minutes, potentially half an hour of time to fix microseconds of audio has actually lost the listener, instead of just keeping the natural language in there and letting them breeze past it as if it was natural. But there's a couple of things that I very briefly want to mention, and that we'd probably place as like really advanced considerations for this. And part of the reason that I mention it is because Brian is potentially still watching at the moment. In one of the podcast forums that we're all in, someone called out DaVinci Resolve's Fairlight editor as a fairly robust audio editor, which we don't necessarily know it to be, and it definitely isn't. I think it's probably one of the few aspects of DaVinci Resolve being a video editing platform that actually suffers a little bit. But the most interesting thing that Brian found, and it makes sense, is that some of the minute edits that you can do in other DAWs to just audio, by the way, this is ignoring the video entirely, is that the timeline for the audio also matches the frame rate of the project, which means that if you want to make a cut at a specific point in the audio, it's harder and harder to do it in a video editor, because it is focused on video, it's focused on frames per second for a particular project. The more frames you have, the more minute you can be with the detailed edits that you can make. And 60 frames tends to be the max for most video stuff. But if you want to be very, what's the word? If you want to be very medical, like you want to take the spatula. What's the word I'm looking for?
Scalpel.
Scalpel. Oh God, I am tired. If you want to take a scalpel to the audio, from Brian's experiment, DaVinci Fairlight isn't going to be able to do that for you. But your DAW is going to be very important for you to be able to scan across that audio and find what is potentially the split of two words in a very fast sentence. Like, we're talking about fractions of a second here that you can use to shuffle to different areas and make that flow happen and hide it. So the DAW you use is incredibly important. And I have forgotten my other point. I refer you to my tiredness. We'll see if it pops up later on. But Brian, shout out for the work you do for the community there as well, if you're still in the audience.
And Mike, we'll get to your last couple comments in a minute. I do want to tie into what you were just saying, though, about the DAW. The one thing that really keeps me using Hindenburg, despite all of the flaws and all of the bugs they've had since they've released Hindenburg 2, is the way it displays the waveforms. It's different than a traditional waveform view, and I'm sure there's some name for it, but it makes it a lot easier to see the syllables in words. It makes it easy to find those consonant sounds that are going to be really easy to splice together. So I can usually splice on the first try most words, provided they have T's, S's, or a few of the other. F's are pretty easy, depending on the consonant. Some words are super easy to do on the first try. Others, if you're having to cut into a vowel, that can be very challenging.
Yep.
But yeah, that's one of the few things Hindenburg offers that I haven't seen in any other DAW that helps me edit faster.
You know what? I just had a thought. I was trying to think of the hardest letters that you would be able to work with. I think the back end of the alphabet tends to be the worst section. Z, Y, W, X. I think they all seem to be the trouble spots. Anyway, just something to keep in mind.
So, Mike's comments. Cutting forward is also an often used fix for when the person stutter starts. Remember, if it's not salient and an added piece of color in the commentary, there's likely something else that'll provide the same value. And I agree with that. I have
I'd say it takes a cursory listen, though. sorry, not to jump on top of you, but like when I do that, you have to retain both where you were in case there isn't anything salient cutting forward, and be able to return to that cut to put it back in the case that it is missing. Like that technique, I think, takes a couple of passes potentially, and you have to be ready to go back and replace it if it's necessary. Sorry, just a thought that surfaced in my brain as you said that.
No, that's a good point to make. I have a series of medical programming that are filled with samples of this. It's almost a given that they're going to mention the vocabulary words they've flubbed, coughed through to fix issues.
I presume coughed, unless there's an acronym there that I'm not aware of. But yeah, that totally makes sense. You know, academic stuff, generally they are great at building context because they'll slowly build through the point, and if they explain it with a single word, they'll often unpack it with a bunch of other words at some point later in the sentence. That's why learning content, you probably can cut quite a lot if there's a flub, and not worry about losing the context in the case that it happens to take place. Although, Mike, I would be very interested if, like, KOFFED, as you've written it there, is a specific acronym that you can share with us for podcast editing.
Knowing Mike, it could be some acronym he's created for himself.
Yeah. Although Ks are hard to work with. I'd be curious what it could possibly be.
Yeah.
Oh, and he's also made a sentence there for me with my little flub.
I want to take a scalpel to my surgeon's scapula and remove it with a spatula for the win. Very nicely done.
That sounds awful and wet. Yeah. Good luck with that.
Agree on built context. In those cases, the remove is far easier. And then for clarity, cough is the name I've made for when someone is blanking through content.
Okay. That's fair. It's a lot shorter than the standard spelling, I guess. I clearly don't know Mike all that well, so maybe there's something in there that I'm missing. Sorry, Mike, not yucking your yum there. Just, as said at the top of the show, I'm very tired. So I'm not going to be the best judge of weird stuff that gets thrown our way.
Okay, so let's go back to our Frankenbites. And I guess I thought of a third situation. We've got words, and we have piecing together two different sentences to form one. Let's focus on that one next. And this is something that I don't think many editors would do on their own, but it's something I'm seeing more and more as people work more from a transcript. These are the types of things you see people working in Descript do, or I have a client who goes through the transcript to make revision notes and will often just cross stuff out like they're a journalist, trying to piece together perfect sentences. And it's like, this doesn't work. But that's what they want, so I give it to them. It doesn't sound good. It sounds edited. But at the end of the day, it's their show. If that's how they want it, it's not my place to fight it. So in those cases, I think trying to Frankenstein two different sentences together to form one, a lot of times that doesn't work because of those mismatches we're talking about. A lot of times you have a tonal mismatch, or there's some kind of subtle nuance there that just doesn't make the two pieces feel like they're cohesive. What's your experience been with those?
The same. I've had a client who's, I'd say, academically meticulous with the transcript. But I want to say in her case, and all power to her, she's approaching it as with English as a second language as well. And I'm hopefully going to have this person on my currently teased named new podcast, that trying to approach reviewing edits where the podcast is in not your primary language, but in coming to English as your secondary language, that adds another layer on top of this stuff. And that could very easily be the case in a lot of cases, as it is here. But yeah, trying to see a sentence that makes sense, but then have it appear in the audio in the same way, is like trying to build a 3-dimensional tower by working with one flat plane at a time. Like, you get one side perfectly straight up, and then you turn it, and then all of a sudden all the pieces are like all in, random spots, because you didn't line up all of the dimensions at the same time. And it's the same with audio. Like, it's the word, the intonation, the pacing, all of these are the dimensions of the conversation being aligned together. And I think the editor is the only person who's in that moment that can build that dimension appropriately in the context that it appears. I think it's very rare to have a client who has or could derive the full context of the editing moment with just the transcript and the audio. You kind of have to be in there, and it would be very rare for I've actually tried this with a few clients, actually, where when you edit an episode, you give them the full project and they review that. Like, that never happens, at least not in my experience. I've tried to make people do it to make it easier for me, and it just hasn't worked. So yeah, the Frankensteining, the intentions are good most of the time, but it just doesn't work. And you have to trust the editor to be able to make those decisions, I think.
And what's your take on Frankenbiting, Frankensteining words together? Or, let me rephrase, not words together, but going through and piecing together a word out of different syllables you found throughout the episode.
Feels rhetorical with the way we both approach this, but I say no. The rule, which you stated very clearly not 10, 15 minutes ago, if it takes you longer than 60 seconds to fix it, it's not worth doing. Just chop it or leave it and continue on. Context is important, but not important enough that for every cut, presuming hundreds of cuts across an episode, that some of those can add so much time to your editing time that it becomes unwieldy and an offering that you can't possibly sustain for every client that you have, unless you want your rates to be through the roof, I also don't think it adds value for the listener most of the time. And part of the reason I say this is because my very first podcast edit that was not me, but me interviewing someone for a solo style episode in my previous life working in state government in Australia, I did the we'll fix it in post attitude to the interview. So I did the interview. I asked the questions that I wanted to get from this person very high up in the organization that, led my department or whatever. And when it came to cutting the conversation together, I took the scalpel attitude. I tried to rebuild everything that she said from every aspect. Like, I was pulling sentences from here and putting them there, and I was grabbing words and phrases from there to make a constructed sentence. It was like I was rebuilding the entire conversation. 40 minutes of audio probably took me 5 or 6 hours to build a conversation on the fly that reflected none of the original discussion. You only do that once, I think. I think that kind of, like, that's the full broad scope Frankenbiting that I think in the context is like reality TV shows and news programs and stuff like that. But that the whole approach to it just makes everything so long. It just becomes unsustainable. And you'd hope that being an editor, like at the start, it's always going to be long. But you want to be able to get better and faster and faster and better over time. And you're not going to do that if you're stitching words together that you presume the person meant by grabbing, or, you know, if the first thing you do is before you tackle a podcast edit is grab a bunch of syllables and phrases and words that you like that you can insert at random moments in the episode, it's not going to be conducive to a good experience for you. And the final product is going to reflect that as well, I think. There are times where you can get away with it. I have been known to pluralize someone's word where they meant to pluralize it, but I don't do it often. Best not to. 60 seconds. That has to be the rule. And I think that's very generous as well. 60 seconds is a long time for an edit of a very small portion of an episode.
And that 60 seconds usually has the decision making to know well before that 60 seconds if the edit can actually be made. So if I spend 60 seconds, it's because in my first attempt at the edit, I'm close and I'm fairly confident I can make this edit. If I make that first edit and it's like, yeah, this doesn't sound possible, I'm just going to undo and move forward. I'm not putting 60 seconds into it. When it comes to Frankensteining a word out of syllables, I'm with you. That's just a no. When I see people talk about that online, I think every single time I've seen it, it's in the context of, I did this for the client and they'll never know. If the client didn't ask for it, why are we putting this time and effort into it? It must not have been a big enough deal for it to stand out to them. And if it is something that the client is requesting, it's going to be faster and cheaper for everybody for them to just re-record that word, that phrase, that sentence, whatever it is. That's going to take, a couple of minutes to hop on Riverside or have them record it locally if that's how they record. It doesn't take anybody any time, and it's going to be a better result than trying to piece together words. I know we talked about this in one of the first streams we did, because someone had done a poll in one of the Facebook groups about, say a client mispronounces a word. Do you try to piece it together? Do you try to find another instance where they say that word somewhere else in the episode, or do you just leave it as is? And a really high percentage of people, I want to say it was about 3/4 of the editors, would put some sort of effort into trying to fix that. I'm one of those that I don't see the need to do that. And I also feel like none of my clients are paying enough for that level of detail, especially when, like we've mentioned, the audience understands the people participating are human, that human speech is never perfect. We're going to, using your instance, mean to use a pluralized word, but we end up using the non-pluralized version. No one's going to stop listening because of that. No one's going to stop listening because we mispronounce a word. And I know there's certain things where you want to get the pronunciation right. I've had clients say, hey, I realize I mispronounced your name at the beginning. I'll re-record it and send it over to you so you can throw it in. Those types of things make sense. If it's a mispronounced name and then they pronounce it correctly later on, I'll probably go and find that now that I'm using Hindenburg that has transcripts. But if I don't have a transcript and I'm trying to edit, I'm not going to go through the audio or take the time to try and transcribe something just to find that. So that's my take on it.
And that reminds me of another addition to your 60-second rule, just very quickly. Again, this is for a different episode, I think. But the revision that is changing 6 words across an hour-and-a-half long interview, if it takes longer than 5 minutes to do it, I don't think it's worth revising that material. And that might be the more controversial kind of revision that, if the client wants it, and you just do it. And I imagine, Jesse, you might have a different opinion about this one, but too many times have I been told to, I just want to remove that and take out that extra and some of this T disappeared with how you edited it. Can you put a little bit more back in? And then it's finalized. Then we're done. That's okay. But it requires me to go into the file, make those changes, discover that the T actually wasn't there, tell them that that's one less edit I can do because it wasn't actually present. We're not Frankenbiting. And re-export, re-upload, seek approval, retranscribe it if it's enough words disappeared that the timestamps get affected. That could affect the chapters that you generate later on, and whether they actually matter, I don't know. I think this is probably more of a pet peeve than guidance, but I think if you've got less than like 4 minute edits that really don't have an impact, and the audience, the person listening to it or watching it would just go, oh, missed that. Oh, I know what he meant though. I think it's fine. I really think it's fine. I'm listening back to myself. It's definitely pet peeve territory. Not advice, just me being irate at certain little quibbles with clients.
So
bad mic noise off that Fifine, mate. That's going to have to go in the review.
Yep. Stupid pencil. I was hoping, and that had to happen just as I'm unmuting. It couldn't have happened with it muted. That's the beauty of live, people. So let's move on from Frankenbiting stuff to advice for people who do edit. The 2 biggest ones I have for people are make sure you're taking breaks. Our brains, like we were talking about with shorts, our brains, our ears, they need breaks. I think we've all been in situations where we've not taken that break and we stop being as objective. We stop kind of hearing a lot of things. My advice is take a break at least once an hour. Get up, take a 5-minute break, walk around the house, get some water, whatever it is. If you have to push it, if you're really on a deadline or you're really in the groove, you can go up to 2 hours. But I wouldn't push it more than that. If you have to do like a 4-hour marathon for some reason, give yourself a good hour before you do any other editing. I mean, I'm a firm believer of not editing for more than about 4 hours in a day. So I don't want to have more than 5 clients at a time or 5 episodes a week that I'm editing, because I don't want to have to edit 2 episodes per day. That's just going to burn my ears out. And talking about our ears, since they are so important to us with what we do, what I find is so many people, they monitor way too loudly. I'll be on recordings with people and I can hear their mic picking up the audio from their headphones, and they're not open back headphones like mine. And you can hear it, and it's like, you don't need your audio to be that loud. And
Yep.
when it comes to editing, I see people talk about, I can't use headphones because they they hurt my ears after a while. My ears get too sensitive. Chances are you're editing or you're monitoring too loudly. I see people say, should I use speakers? I'm all for using monitor speakers for mixing because they're going to be, you need space to truly hear the sound. You don't get that same sense of space when monitoring in headphones, but that's kind of beside the point. We're all pretty much going to be using headphones. If you're using speakers, I feel like you have to turn them up too loud to be able to hear those bad cuts. You can hear all of that detail at such low volumes when using headphones. When it comes to setting volume, the best advice I can give, and this was something that was instilled in me as a kid by my dad, always start with the volume at its lowest setting. Turn it up slowly until you can hear it. You hear everything. With most headphones, no, with speakers and a lot of audio interfaces, there's a place where there's just not enough volume, so you don't get the full sound. So you need to get that one more click so you're getting the full sound. A lot of times I'll hear it as it's not as full, it's lacking bass, but you get it to the right place, and all of a sudden, and on mine, I have a detented knob, so it's a matter of one click, and it goes from really thin to full sounding. That's where I monitor at. With headphones, I turn it up until I hear the level of detail I need and leave it there. If the thinking behind that is our ears are more sensitive to increases in, they're more sensitive to increases in volume than decreases. Or maybe it's the other way around. Either way.
I think it's both. Like, I don't know. I'm having as much trouble as you, I guess. I think if you normalize a louder volume, that becomes your normal. If you want to go softer, you have to, there's a time of adjustment where you need to adapt to the lower sound to be able to pick up that sensitivity. And part of the reason that I say that is because I can't really listen or talk in loud parties anymore, because I've spent so much time picking up the nuanced details of sound. Now I pick up everything in a room, and that's because my ears have adapted to that. I think it does adapt both ways, though going from loud to soft is a bit slower. Although that's anecdotal. I don't have research or anything on that.
I thought of a better way of putting it.
Mm-hmm.
When we're listening at a set volume, if we turn it down, our ears feel like we're losing a lot. Whereas when we turn it up, our ears just hear it as being louder. So it's a lot more challenging to turn volumes down. That's why it's so smart to start with your volume all the way down and turn it up until you hear what you need. Because if you just leave it at whatever volume you had it on, maybe I was listening to music and I was having a lot of coding or AI work that day. I might turn the music up a little bit higher. I'm just in the mood for that. If I were to try to edit with that, I come in, I'm at that level. I try to turn it down, it sounds muffled. It doesn't sound as clear. My brain feels like something's missing. That's why it's tougher to turn volume down. I'm not going to go there. Just start with the volume at its lowest setting, turn it up slowly until you hear what you need, and leave it there. If you find yourself needing to turn it up, that's your brain telling you you need to get up and take a break because your ears are losing their sensitivity. You just need a reset. You come back, leave the volume where it was without turning it up, and it's going to sound fine when you come back.
Yep. But even at a fundamental level, that isn't just the fatigue associated with editing audio. There's a law of diminishing returns with the amount that you work anyway. Like if you do an hour and then take a 10-minute break and then come back, that gives you a bit of a refresh. You know, you take a break for your ears, but as well, you are taking a break from making decisions about your audio, so you don't get as fatigued with how many small choices you make all the way through the episode cut. Looking at the screen for as long as you do, odds are it's not going to be in a movie cinema where you've got meters between you. It's going to be a screen where you've got your face about that far away from it. You need to move your eyes around the room. The 20-20-20 rule is one that sticks with me after doing a bit of research from my time in government as well. During the pandemic for remote work, it's, what is it? Every 20 minutes, move your eyes 20 degrees to look 20 meters, something like that. But basically change your viewing distance so that your eyes have a chance to adapt and recover from doing so much short eyesight work. Like there's a lot of components to having a break between your workflow to make sure you can come back more refreshed. And if you're doing a 4-hour stint and it takes you 6 hours to do work that should take 3, but if you take a big old break in the middle, or you split it out across 2 days and instead it takes you 3 hours to finish it, I think overall that volume of time and that break is incredibly valuable to you because you become much more efficient. Just muscling through it because you feel like you want to get it done in one go, it's not going to yield the same results. And you'll make mistakes. You know, the back half of the effort will have errors in it that you'll have missed because your attention will be waning as well. I think from that perspective, it's the ears and all of that together makes the breaks incredibly important. And it might not apply to everybody in the same way that applies to people like us. I love that you said 4 hours per day of editing. That's it. I think that's really important. I remember I tried to make a post a couple of years ago on a very similar line where I said, I think as a piece of advice for editors, hey, don't go all day, buddy. Like you need to allow yourself a bit of time to not be in front of the computer editing and do other things. And someone came in and said, oh, no, man, I could go for like 8 or 9 hours a day, no problem. And I was like, bruh, nah, that's not happening. You're not going to go. You'll be an editor for a year and then you'll be spending your time lying on your back, staring at the sky with earplugs in. It's not going to be a good time.
We've got another comment from Mike. Sound levels. I'm typically going 70% on the system and then green, occasionally flashing onto yellow in my DAW for the edit. And when you're talking about sound levels, are you talking about your monitoring or the levels within the DAW? Because
I think he's got a good point. Sorry, I'll let you finish your sentence. I don't want to jump on top of you.
No, go ahead.
Someone mentioned offhanded to me in one of the interviews I'm going to be releasing for my new podcast, when I made what at the time I didn't intend to be, but a sweeping statement about hearing audio, like listening to what you're editing to be able to do it. And this bloke who's he is an unreal editor. His ear for audio is insane. He is like A++, S tier editor. He said, but monitor your levels, like use the instruments, use what you've got in front of you. Instead of what people end up saying, like, not to put Mike on the spot here, but saying like, I have my volume at 70% and monitor at this level and make sure that this is at this number. That, like we said before, is a grand sweeping statement for people to protect their ears by having less than 70% volume. Doesn't necessarily work, but using the numbers and dialing in with the advice that you said earlier, Jesse, that turn it up to the level that you're comfortable with, that you can only just hear the details that you need and stick it there. If you can, record the computer settings that also show that. And if you're in a DAW that has a meter that's available to you, where you can see the dB as they go up and down, you can use that as a measure to show where your listening volume is in comparison to the recorded volume that you have. Because just like this bloke said to me, you can't do it entirely by ear. You need to use the instruments that you have in front of you. You could get to the end of an edit, hear the compression, do all that work, perfectly fine. And then the output becomes negative 23 dB. And all of a sudden, you're not up to podcast standard. Making sure that you use those levels on the instruments in your DAW or whatever it is that you have in front of you, even the audio interface, if it's just you talking, all of those together guide your ability to both record at a volume that makes sense without clipping, etc., but also with the editing volume, what the output is compared to what you're listening to. And you have a frame of reference beyond having to just start at 0 and then turn it all the way up again. Not that it's not the only way, but using those levels as a reference and having a map that you can kind of refer back to saves you a bit of time, kind of like templating a project for a particular client kind of thing.
So Mike followed up. Computer volume at 70%, literally the number 70 in Windows. I'm not sure how that relates because I'm using an audio interface and I'd say my volume knob for my headphones is at about 25% of its entire throw, but I'm not sure how that relates to a system like a computer controlled audio output. It might be similar. I don't know. 70% in my world seems like it would be really high, but that's the world of audio interfaces. For a computer, maybe 70 is a really reasonable level. So I hope
that's the complexity though. That's the complexity though that I was trying to get at. Like one number doesn't cover it. Because if I go through my whole chain, I got my volume at 80%. Chrome browsers are at 50%. So it's 50% of that 80. And then I've got my knob at like 1 or 2 o'clock for both headphones and the mix between DAW and the computer volume and monitoring the microphone. So for me, there are so many failure points there that I couldn't possibly tell you what volume I'm listening to anything at because there's so many moving parts in it. But as long as you have a frame of reference for yourself and understand the chain of everything you've done, then that's the important bit. And then having the meters to be able to tell you whether you're clipping and, you know, what volume the recording is at and stuff. But sorry,
I agree.
Yeah.
And another part of his follow-up, the dancing meter in the DAW and the green occasionally dancing to yellow. I'm someone, I like to know exactly how loud stuff is, so I'm using a loudness meter on every track because like you were mentioning earlier, I want to hear the finished output at its final volume. That way I know what to expect. I don't like surprises from mixing at, say, negative 23 LUFS, getting everything finished, and then exporting that, running it through RX to bring it up to negative 16. I don't know what it's going to sound like. And I don't want to go back and have to listen to it or spot check it. I'd rather just listen to it as I go at final volume. And that's what we've talked about. Everybody has their own system, their own way of working. And LUFS are a relatively new thing. So for people who've been doing this for a while, it's going to be, they might have different workflows based on how they've learned and built their process. There's no right or wrong here. And we've got about 20 minutes before I need to wrap up. So I want to finish up on tips for faster editing. These are the things that have helped me speed up my process over time. And probably the two things that gave me the biggest improvements straight off the bat were when I moved from Logic to Hindenburg, just because it has a much more efficient workflow. It just allowed me to edit faster. So that saved me a ton of time. I think that took me from about 6 hours per episode when I was first starting out in Logic down to about 4 hours, just by making that one switch. And that was immediate. That wasn't over time as I became familiar with it. That was simply by switching at the end of one project in Logic to starting up using Hindenburg. The other thing that's given me a huge boost in efficiency is moving away from the Apple Magic Mouse to a programmable mouse. I'm using the Logitech MX Master 3, which I'm not sure how well this will show, but it's got a scroll wheel to scroll horizontally along with the vertical scroll wheel. You've got two buttons here that you can hit with your thumb. So between those three things, I'm able to scroll through my timeline without moving my mouse. And I have those two programmable buttons programmed to cut and delete. I can do about probably 80% of my edits straight from the mouse without having to use the keyboard at all. For my other most commonly used editing technique, I've set up a macro. Hindenburg out of the box doesn't support macros, but at least on Mac, we have Keyboard Maestro and Better Touch Tool. Better Touch Tool is the one I use to build this macro for Hindenburg, which is I select a piece of audio. No, if I delete a piece of audio, there's certain situations where it doesn't close the gap, and I would have to like triple click in that gap and then press backspace to delete that to pull everything together. Those triple mouse clicks, they start to take a toll on the wrist after a while. So I built a macro that all I have to do is select that space, push one button, and it does everything itself. So between that one keyboard key and my mouse, I can do about 95% of my edits. It's only if I need to apply a fade that I have to do something with the keyboard that is more than just the one key. So that's really helped me out. And then outside of those two things, what's helped me was for video editing, using the Stream Deck along with keyboard shortcuts. I do most of my edits with the mouse and the Stream Deck, mouse in one hand, Stream Deck in the other. I'm not using the keyboard at all. And so just practice.
Before you move on, very quickly, I see people talk about the Stream Deck with, like, I understand programmable keys built into the software, Elgato or whoever puts the programs in there perfectly. You hold it and like thumb the buttons like a remote. You've muted yourself again. Oh, that's where the button lives.
Yep. It just sits on the desk. It's got 4 knobs, 8 buttons.
Okay. So it's not uncomfortable to use the shortcuts that way?
No, I'm just pushing a button or rotating a knob.
Okay. Interesting.
So I can use the knobs to quickly zoom in and out horizontally.
Mm-hmm.
I can use the buttons for different edits.
That's great.
So that's helped me quite a bit with the video editing, because Final Cut, there's a ton of keyboard shortcuts. They're not at all easy to remember. A lot of them require both hands. So, or at least taking my hand off the mouse, which impacts efficiency. So if I can't do it with the left hand, I want to create something I can use with the Stream Deck to speed up my workflow.
Okay.
And the
It was
last
really
thing,
the wrist position and the ability to hit the buttons without doing stuff. That was what I was curious about. Sorry, your last thing.
yeah, it sits at about a 45-degree angle, so to me it feels really comfortable. You just find the right place to position it and you're fine. The last thing
Good to know.
was just practice. I've actually learned more or become better. I've just become better overall as I started the community and started answering people's questions and helping them figure out how to solve this or that problem, because it put me in a situation where I'm getting practice that isn't just the work that I'm working on. It allows me to think and work through things and just build up that decision making. So, yeah, practice and repetitions, there's no shortcut for that. The more you do it, the faster your decision making gets. Realize being able to listen in real time, or actually, I work at usually 1.8 speed,
Yeah, you do.
1.8 or 1.7, but being able to listen at that speed and know in real time, do I need to stop to make this edit? A lot of you can tell. If it's connected to the next word, there's no point to stop and try to cut that out. That's what I mean by decision making, or being able to hear you knows and tell if there's a space between the you know and the word after it. Some people give you a nice clean gap there. Others, that word kind of blends together. So being able to tell in real time, can I edit that out or not, really makes you more efficient. So decision making and the decision making that comes from repetitions and practice really helps make us faster.
I would agree with both. The last things that you just said there was going to be one of mine. That practice makes you faster, and solving problems helps you improve your workflow and your speed. Now, I did promise somebody, might have been House of Jen, last week that we were going to talk about Systems 1 and Systems 2 thinking from Daniel Kahneman and how that can apply to this. I'm not going to explain it here. I'm going to tell anyone who's interested in looking up a simple explanation to go to Veritasium, that YouTube channel, and look for, I think it's the episode on education or learning technologies, where he explains Systems 1 and Systems 2 thinking very well. But basically, System 1 is the stuff that you don't think about a lot, and System 2 is the stuff that requires a lot of thinking energy. When you start with podcast editing, you're doing a lot of Systems 2 thinking. It takes you time. You need to intentionally do a lot of things, but the more that you do, the more practice and reps you put in, the more of that moves to Systems 1, where you don't have to think about it. Kind of like when you drive a car and you don't realize when or how you've been driving for the last 10 minutes. You've just done it. That's the value that comes with the practice. But you talking about the community giving you extra problems for you to solve, I think it's a really good way when you don't have a community, or even if you don't have clients like we do that have weird audio or unusual environments that are problems that we get to solve. If you're on your own doing your own podcast, creating your own content, I would urge you, as you're editing, when you get into more Systems 1 and you start thinking about the different things, you have space to think about the stuff that you're doing as you do it. Find where the choke points are and note that down as a problem for you to spend a few hours solving. And those few hours will pay off when you do future edits, as you save minutes and minutes and minutes of time as you go through each individual edit to continue improving. And then think about the Systems 2 of solving that problem initially, and then the practice pushing it into systems one, and those decisions that you talked about, Jesse, getting quicker and quicker and quicker until you can get to listening at 2 times speed and just solve all those problems together. I think that might be the only way that you can really become an effective podcast editor. There are going to be those that are talented, but talented without experience, I think you end up in the place where they seek validation through Frankenbiting and things like that. So super important. And on brand, I've forgotten the second because I explained too much of the first. So I'm going to stick with that as my answer. Focus on problems, solve problems that you have for yourself, and do the practice to work to be a 100% systems one thinking, editing machine, and you'll have a great time. But don't do 100% systems one. Like you want to be able to find where the problems are so that you can, spend some time figuring those out. 80-20.
And for anybody who might be interested in that YouTube Veritasium, you said, can you give us a pointer on how that might be spelled? Because that's one of those words there could be a few different attempts.
Yes, Veritasium, Veritasium. Sounds very much like something on the periodic table, and I guarantee you'll find it. He's a Derek, I can't remember his last name, been on YouTube for a long time. Even if you spell it wrong, you'll be able to find him.
Could sound like a medication too.
It could.
Ask your doctor about Veritasium.
which could be a very neat joke, because the name derives from the Latin veritas, which is truth. So they might take it as a bit of a slight if you go, hey, do you think you're not getting the right information from me? Jog on. Anyway,
I like that.
Veritasium.
But yeah, there's really no shortcut for that kind of experience. And for me, when I was starting out, all I had was audio I'd recorded. I have good equipment. I record in a good sounding space, so that didn't help me. So what I started doing is whenever somebody would post audio online that they were struggling with, for some reason, I don't see people post that very often these days. But
no, and I think it's a big problem too. I think courses that have practice audio, they don't include bad audio usually. They have the bloke who's made this course because he's done podcast editing for 10 years. He records it on an SM7B or an RE20, and there's very little work to do with a microphone like that recorded in a great environment. So find courses that have very poor quality audio that you can repair and fix up. I know that you've got a few samples that you use in Tansiasta Academy that are ideal. I think I've seen those.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time trying to find examples that give people something to really work with that's going to, because a big part of the course was RX stuff. And I needed to have content or clips people could work on that would help them develop those skills with using RX. Because if you have decent sounding audio, you're not going to be able to use a lot of those modules. I mean, really, I think another part of why we don't see it so much is the tools have gotten so much better over the last 5 years that most people don't even need to use RX. Or if they do, they're using 1 or 2 modules as plugins. But RX, it's intimidating. It's overwhelming for anybody who has never used it. There's a huge learning curve there. So I think that's why we don't see nearly as many people posting problematic audio, because between plugins like DX Revive Pro, stuff like Adobe's Voice Enhance, Descript Studio Sound, there are so many options out there to clean up audio that that's not really a challenge anymore. And for I look at that and I think, okay, that's another reason why I'm moving away from editing being my primary service, because audio cleanup was a very specialized skill. It's been replaced by AI. People aren't hiring us because we know how to use RX and clean up audio in a really skilled way. They can do that themselves with Descript, and they can't hear the difference. If we're still using RX, we're probably just affecting our efficiency and making it harder for us to compete on price, as the perceived value of editing gets diminished by all of these AI tools.
It's just that we have all the answers to the questions that audio doesn't ask anymore, because they've been made obsolete. There you go. I found it.
Pretty much.
But it's really good shout for last week's stream, though. People should go back to that and hear us talk about plugins and Isotope and all those aspects that you just mentioned briefly.
Yeah, we went pretty in depth on plugins and all of that. And
yes,
with editing, the truth is, once they figure out how to, the developers of platforms like Descript and Riverside, once they crack the code on how to smartly identify cut points and additionally be able to identify intonation mismatches, it's game over for podcast editors. And we're getting to the point where the AI can listen to the audio and make assessments, at least, as far as pitch. So I'm thinking the intonation mismatches that's something that's coming soon. It's just a matter of it figuring out how to identify the places to cut. Once AI knows how to make smart cuts and knows when to leave things in because of those nuances, what's left for us to do other than to manage the process? And I think that's probably a topic for another day.
Definitely. We'll call it the AI Doomer episode. Why you're not a podcast editor anymore.
I mean, let's hope that's still a ways down the road, but with how quickly AI is moving, you never know.
Yeah. Anyway, things are good at the moment. We'll just keep going as we are.
Yep. I think that's a nice positive note to end things on. Thank you to Mike and Brian for participating in the chat today. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and we'll see you next week. Have a good one.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody. Everyone. Everybody. Stop the stream. This is just going to go on
Just pick one.
Bye.
Everyone. Bye.